Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to Procrastinator's Pit Stop. We are back with another amazing guest for you right now today. We are sitting here with Fiona Raikes. Fiona believed that she had full control over her life until chronic insomnia left her feeling desperate, broken, and alone. Through trial, error, and self-discovery, she reclaimed her sleep and now dedicates herself to guiding people toward holistic solutions for insomnia, ensuring they never feel powerless or alone in their pursuit of better rest. Fiona, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Chris, for having me. I'm excited to be here.
And we're definitely excited to to dig into this topic because it is something that is very interesting. Before we dive into it, though, we do like to have an icebreaker on the show, and the question for you today is: which cartoon character do you resonate with the most, and why?
Yeah. So we talked about this lightly before we got started, and I think I've definitely decided to change who we had originally spoken about. And I would say that I resonate mostly with Mulan, like the Disney character. At least I think it's Disney, but could be wrong. And that's because I grew up in South America, and I used to feel like there's still very huge difference between like genders and like what women and men are like expected to do. And I used to really want to be like just like her, like wanted to be able to do all of the things that the boys could do as well. And I feel like that's also kind of defined a lot of like my life, just being always increasingly competitive in both sports, professional life, personal life, etc. So I'd say that she's my inspirational character.
I like that. Mulan, yeah, from Disney. Actually, there's more than one now. There's there's the Mulan, which is the cartoon version, and there's the live version. I kind of like the cartoon version better though because of the dragon. I think the dragon was probably my favorite character. But yeah. So let's just slide into this a little bit now. So, Fiona, how would you define procrastination, and what does it mean to you personally?
Hmm. I'd say like when you want to get stuff done, but you just have to do something else instead. That's like the main thing for me. And I think it's defined by like also quite a lot of distractions or simultaneously maybe not wanting to do the task at hand as much. So we also live in an increasingly distracting world, which is also not so easy.
I like that. And we all know that there's no one cure for everything or, one size fits all or silver bullet. What's been your secret sauce for overcoming procrastination?
I feel like I'm still trying to deal with it on a day-to-day basis, to be honest. But I feel like I try to make lists out of the things that I want to achieve every single day, and I make sure that I tackle them. And it's funny because, dopamine is like almost like one of the main reasons why we get distracted, which is kind of like those quick and easy dopamine hits. But it's also been proven that if you have a list of things and you actually cross it out, that in itself is also a dopamine hit. And that kind of like feels good. It's like that sense of achievement. And at the moment, like we will get into it like a relatively new as insomnia recovery or sleep coach. I'm also a yoga teacher. I have a full-time job and a lot of things that I like to do. And I feel like things don't get done if you continuously get distracted. So my lists and my time blocking in my schedule is also so important. So if I'm going to do something, whether it's, I don't know, content for my social media or like, of course, during the week, also my main job at the moment, then everything's really very much time blocked for when that takes place.
I like that time blocking and just making sure that you are organizing things into those lists. I can get behind that for sure. Now, we're talking about insomnia, and one of the questions that I had for you is how do you know if it's really insomnia or if it's just, you know, I'm just like, you know, eating something I shouldn't before bed or something. I'm just not sleeping.
Yeah, that's such an excellent question because I feel like so many people are like, oh, I had insomnia last night if they had a poor night of sleep, or they, for example, women maybe like deal with like hormonal fluctuations and have sleep disruption. So that's exactly like to your point, there exists sleep disruption and then also insomnia. Sleep disruption meaning, I don't know, you drank coffee too late, you're maybe stressed for something that's going to happen the next day, you have jet lag, like anything that could potentially disrupt your sleep is sleep disruption alone. However, sleep disruption can also be physiological. So meaning, again, hormonal differences, maybe physically you have some kind of like impairment at the moment. Those are all sleep disruptions. When it starts to be insomnia is actually how you relate to the sleep disruption. So it turns into something being a little bit more like an issue of itself once you start seeing that disrupted sleep as something that you need to fear. And that's actually where I didn't even know that this was a thing before I went through my own insomnia journey. But insomnia truly is the fear of not sleeping. And that in itself causes you not to sleep.
Huh. Wow. Okay, so I feel like that should have been explained to me at some point. But I mean, you're right. If I stop to think about the root of the word, we've got agoraphobia, arachnophobia, but it doesn't have the word phobia in it. So yeah, I never really considered.
Yeah. And also there's just so much, there's just not enough knowledge out there, well, it's one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about it, because I felt like recovery for me took way longer than I had hoped. And it was such a difficult experience, insomnia. Well, like I think everybody has a bad night of sleep. Imagine insomniacs go on with like those kinds of bad nights of sleep where you just can't shut up your brain for days at a time or weeks at a time, and sometimes years, months, you name it. And there's just so much misinformation in terms of like what insomnia is. And people keep saying like, well, yeah, just drink some tea or do something nice or do some exercise. But realistically, when you have like a fear, it's completely psychological. You can't drink tea to then fix your psychological relationship with sleep.
No, that makes a lot of sense. So when you talk about insomnia, I guess that could also be tied to like adrenal fatigue as well.
Can you elaborate?
Well, if you're not able to sleep and you're constantly in this state of fear, potentially, you've got adrenaline running through there, and it's keeping you from being asleep. Is it because the adrenaline is this body's stress response, right? So could insomnia also be related to adrenal fatigue, or is it more so that insomnia is only between those hours of when you're actually supposed to be sleeping, and then during the day it just doesn't?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I actually haven't seen this myself quite yet, but the thing is, it's tied to this kind of like state of being in hyperarousal. So you're totally right around like the adrenaline that keeps you kind of like awake. To kind of like back it up a bit, it's when you have a fear of not sleeping, that means that you have the fear of the opposite, right? Of wakefulness. Your fear is also your fight or flight response system, which is then like your stress response, which deploys 100% adrenaline and cortisol through your body, which is what keeps you awake. But the response is more your nervous system response system rather than like something that like classified as adrenal fatigue. Whether or not adrenal fatigue would also cause insomnia, that's where I would say someone like a sleep doctor comes in. But 99% of people struggling with insomnia, which is 1/10 of the population, it tends to be more the physiological relationship with sleep and that misidentification of threat.
So in your experience and your travels and your research, what are some of the main causes of insomnia? I mean, we know it's fear, but what leads to that?
Yeah, it's interesting because we all have these poor nights of sleep sometimes, and it's just one poor night can then turn into many. And I guess the question can be like, well, what happened that one night? Like what went wrong, like in that one night? And I'd say that, like, it can be caused by so many different things. And this is where I don't really think that insomnia as a whole, like, is unique per person. But maybe how it started is a lot more unique. So like from my own perspective, I was going through quite a lot of change in my life. I was moving in with a partner of mine at the time. I moved cities. So anybody would classify this as like a highly stressful period in my life. And him and I had very different sleep schedules. And if anything, I think that was like what actually caused it, was the idea that having different sleep schedules would mean that somebody would continuously come in and wake me up. Hence kind of resulting in that fear of being awake. So that's, of course, my story. Other people, sometimes they take, I've heard quite often, like some kind of medication to like lose weight. And as you maybe know, that it has quite a lot of like caffeine in it, which would then mean you have sleep disruption. And then you kind of react to that sleep disruption poorly. So you kind of like create that association. Maybe you're on other kinds of medications that also create the sleep disruption. Maybe it's hormonal changes that you're going through. Maybe you just had a baby, so you're already experiencing sleep deprivation. Like there's just so many things that can cause it. But most importantly is just what changes is like your relationship to sleep from that moment onwards. That is kind of shifts you into like a perspective of being an insomniac versus just someone who slept badly.
And how do you start kind of pulling at that thread once you've I guess, discovered this?
As someone who's like, as an insomniac, or like as someone who helps people?
Well, I guess, as an insomnia, like from somebody who helps them, how do you start pulling at those threads and figuring out how to, alleviate?
Yeah. So usually by the time they come and work with someone like me, they have probably exhausted all avenues. So it's quite normal for insomnia to start and then you quickly go into fix it mode because you have a fear, and because our it's sometimes funny, like our intellect is almost like too smart for our like survival instincts. And when there's like a fear in place and there's something that we think that is a potential threat, automatically our brain is going to try to do anything to either prove or disprove that or fix it, right? So you kind of like go online and you try and Google, okay, what do I need to do? How do I fix it? And it becomes this idea that sleep is a controllable factor in your life. So this is where like, all of that common sleep advice of like, I don't know, no screens before bed, don't drink coffee, take some melatonin, have some CBD, you name it. That's where they kind of start implementing all of these behaviors. They'll start working with someone like me months after they've probably gone through all the ups and downs of realizing that none of these things actually work. And we don't realize that at the moment, but a lot of times doing these things actually make the situation worse because they're reconfirming the fact that wakefulness is a threat, right? You're like re-implying like, oh yeah, the fact that you're not sleeping is bad. And then you're trying to fix it and then it's not working. And it's like, it just almost becomes a spiral. So once they start working with someone like me, I think it's a very important identification to say, like, yeah, let's understand how your insomnia started, but it doesn't actually matter. Like what happened, what started it is more like, how did you relate to it and what happened right after that? And oftentimes that's like an amazing, like, oh, wow, like it makes so much sense if you think about it.
And what are some of the common like programs? Like, let's say I go to you and I say, Fiona, I just can't, I just can't. Like, what are the first what are the first sort of steps in the plan of moving forward?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. Again, whenever I'm working with someone, my approach is also very personalized. Like there's other coaches that have kind of like standardized like protocols or like a standard kind of like group offer or like course that they would do. In my perspective, I like to like just see where people are at. There's a lot of free resources online. So maybe even if they've done something like cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, which is like the number one recommended therapy for insomnia, even though it only has a 70% like effectivity rate, they've maybe tried all these things. So they come to me already with a little bit of information. And my approach is a combination of CBTI, so it's cognitive behavioral therapy with also acceptance commitment therapy. And the combination of both of these is highly, highly effective. Like I don't really know anybody who hasn't recovered from insomnia using these principles. And I would say like, okay, let's understand where you're at, how much you know. And I personally like to classify kind of like what they need into 4 buckets. So 1, it's education, definitely like understanding insomnia, understanding sleep, why they're in that position. 2, becoming very comfortable with being uncomfortable because it's an uncomfortable situation that you're continuously trying to escape and you can't just run away from it. You can't run away from sleep. You need to sleep every single day. And then 3, it's befriending wakefulness, which means like reteaching your brain that the threat is not real, whether it's through like cognitive restructuring or like emotional resilience training, unhooking from your emotions, like different types of techniques really work for this. And then lastly, 4, which is a little bit more woohoo, I guess, but it's implementing a lot of self-kindness and compassion because it is a difficult process and it's not something that you can just fix overnight.
And why don't you go into a little bit about your own journey and how did you even decide that, like, we know that you had your own struggles with this, but how did you decide that you wanted to be,
Yeah. It's for anybody who's listening and who's had insomnia, it is absolute hell. Like it's the hardest experience that I have ever had to go through. As somebody who's quite the perfectionist and type A, like I feel like I've always had so much control over everything in my life. And I guess that's also contributed to the whole problem to begin with. But it was something that I just really struggled with for a very long time. And once I started realizing or having these insights, like on the educational front, I also decided to work with a coach who helped me along with this journey. I feel like the teachings from Insomnia were so insightful that they, I think, trickled down into so many other aspects of life, like aspects of control, the illusion of control, the illusion of perfection. There's so many kind of like silver linings that also, as in parallel being a yoga teacher, I feel like resonated quite a lot with who I am and how I like to view the world. And I also felt like, how could it be that it took me so long as somebody who's like continuously trying to check for solutions? I couldn't understand how it had taken me so long to find the resources that I did. And I really wanted to like do the same for others, or like being a resource and a clutch and a help for other people during those difficult moments as somebody who had personally experienced it. So very inspired by my own story and also resonating with other people who, you know, it robs you of everything in your life. Like it affects your friendships, or your relationships in general. It can take you away from performing at your job. You can lose your job over this, your physical health, mental health. Like sleep is the foundation of everything, if you think about it.
No, I mean, you're absolutely right. As you were speaking there, I mean, I remembered dating myself here. Oh man, what was the movie Fight Club,
Mm-hmm.
where he had insomnia. He was actually up making soap all day or something. You remember?
Yeah.
You remember?
Yeah, I do remember. And actually, I guess that's kind of like a good teaching of like, if you can't sleep, at least do something else with your time instead of just lying there trying to force sleep to happen.
And in your own journey, what do you think was the most surprising thing you learned about yourself?
I think that I can like overcome hard things. Like I really think that if you can overcome something like insomnia, you can really like, everything else kind of seems like it doesn't, your problems just don't seem that big anymore, you know, like that you're a lot more resilient. And this is something that I like also say quite a lot to my clients, because oftentimes they'll come to me and say, I feel like I don't know, like I can't deal with this, or like it's just too much. And I think that one of the biggest teachings is like knowing that you're actually a lot more resilient than you think.
And when we're talking about insomnia and trying to get things going, what do you think is the biggest challenge when you're just getting started?
Letting go of the fear. Like I think like your logical brain understands, like educationally can understand like what is happening, but letting go of that fear, which is more like your survival instinct, it's like these two different parts of our body or like our minds just don't really speak to each other at all. So I think like truly like trusting and letting go is something that is incredibly difficult. And it's, you know, oftentimes when you even, now that you know a bit more about insomnia, and it's, you think that by befriending wakefulness, you need to almost be okay with the fact that you have insomnia to overcome it. You know, like a lot of people are like, okay, well, I need to be okay with the fact that I'm awake. And I think that that's also like not exactly where it's at. It's more like you can want to sleep and like have that as your North Star, but you need to learn to be okay with where you're at. And I think that's also unbelievably difficult to truly do in practice.
You know, I'm curious, as you're talking about wakefulness,
Mm-hmm.
you know, being okay with being awake. So, you know, and I don't know, is part of that also, or part of the toolbox mindfulness for that then as well?
Yeah, 100%. Like mindfulness can help specifically with that, with like the relationship that you have with wakefulness, as opposed to how a lot of people use mindfulness for insomnia, which is, well, I'm going to meditate, meaning I'm going to be able to sleep. So it always comes down to the intention of like why you do certain things. So mindfulness, great tools, even things like breathing, etc., for to become comfortable with being uncomfortable, or to just acknowledge that your thoughts are not real and those kinds of things.
And besides us using the word, or besides us using the you know, the terminology correctly, what are some of the other major misconceptions with insomnia?
I think a lot of people just think it's not curable. And like so many people end up like just living like this for years. And like they're just in absolute denial. And then another one is, we briefly touched on this before we even started recording, but the belief that only medical professionals can help you. And this is where also, as somebody who's personally gone through insomnia, my doctor gave me prescribed a prescription to like not work for a week, I think, like a time off kind of allowance. And then he also prescribed me sleeping pills, but had zero knowledge about sleep. And, you know, a lot of times like you turn to your medical professionals for help from a position where you're very desperate. And actually he, in this case, made things worse. And for everybody who I speak to who has insomnia, that's always the case. Their medical doctor or like their GPs have no idea unless you're seeing like a sleep specialist. Most doctors have zero training on sleep. And I think that this is where like we need to start questioning like who we receive advice from, because just because somebody has a piece of paper and a degree, it doesn't mean that they're going to have the best advice for you.
You know, I like that you brought that up. I had sort of a similar experience. It wasn't me. Somebody that I'm very close to they couldn't sleep. They had insomnia, but they actually went to like a sleep clinic where, you know, first of all, they sent this individual to a sleep clinic during the day. So like, okay, whatever. But, you know, aside from that, they prescribed this chemical that, you know, when you did your research, it was actually pretty detrimental, and it didn't wind up helping at all. So I mean, I can definitely understand that that's there, but I mean that goes hand in hand with the whole that there's not a ton of. It's not that there's not a ton of research. I'm sure that there's a lot of research. It's just that there's not a lot of. Is it maybe interest or?
I think to be honest, I don't even think there's a huge amount of research either. Like I think like now we have more and more people, even like me, because for example, even like cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, which is like the number one kind of like treatment, like medicine free like treatment that there currently is, its efficacy is like not very high. And then like someone like me who also combines like these traditional therapies with something like acceptance and commitment therapy, there's just not a lot of people like us that kind of like combine both of those. So I think that maybe there is research, but like 99% of the population looks things up. You're not going to be looking at scientific studies as to like how insomnia like happens or like what that is. But what you do read is like just that even like the top 10 Google searches or your social media or even like YouTube. And a lot of the times they're like, it's people talking about sleep, or even, well, we all know about Andrew Huberman and like his sleep protocol. And that's not helpful for insomniacs. Like it's actually perpetuating the problem. So I just think that there's not enough of the right information out there. And also when a lot of information is given around sleep, I think that sometimes they fail to acknowledge like how the sleep advice is applicable. Because yeah, you can have a sleep protocol if you have like zero issues with sleep, and maybe that'll improve your sleep quality. But I feel like that's where they forget to say that. Like this is to improve your sleep quality, not to fix your insomnia. So
they were fixing the quality, but not the quantity.
Exactly. And not
it's
like
interesting.
The ability to fall asleep. Like Andrew Huberman talks a lot about sleep, and it's just not helpful for insomniacs at all.
And I'm curious, insomnia, I mean, do you have like a predisposition for it? I mean, kind of like, you know, alcoholism or addictive personality. Could you also inherit that trait as well for insomnia?
Yeah. Like, no, maybe not inherited, but it's more like a personality trait that is like within you. But from my perspective, it tends to be like perfectionist, type A people who like control. Yeah, that's like normally like more of a predisposition for insomnia.
You mentioned control. So I guess a lot of it is just like relinquishing that control, because I remember, and I've told this to my own daughter too, is that, you know, she's like, I tried so hard to fall asleep. I tried so hard to fall asleep. I just couldn't fall asleep. Well, it's like, if you're focusing on falling asleep, you're trying to force it. Therefore, you are increasing the activity in your brain. So is that the right line of reasoning, or am I just full of it?
Yeah, 100%. And also it's, as soon as you have that thought, like I'm trying to sleep, means that if you don't sleep, then something is wrong. But like anything that perhaps like feels like a potential threat is going to activate the complete opposite state of your rest and digest. So 100%, like when your daughter's like, I tried to sleep, it's like, well, the fact that you're trying to sleep is the reason why you're not sleeping in the first place. You can't make sleep happen. In fact, it's like your hunger cues, they just happen by themselves. Like it's, you cannot control them. Obviously you can continuously eat and not feel them, but sleep is something that your body will give you if you allow it.
And there's a really popular joke, but I don't, I'm only saying it to give some frame of reference. Is insomnia, I mean, is it dangerous? I mean, we know that if you don't sleep entirely for 7-10 days, certain things can happen and you can, get very sick and even die. But I mean, normally insomnia is not fatal, right?
No, no, not at all. And actually that's part of one of the biggest fears, which then also makes the problem worse, is like thinking that the lack of sleep is going to be in some way detrimental to your health. And this is where, correlation is definitely not causation. And all of these studies around like the lack of sleep are not, if you think about it, they're not actually that accurate, because you can't purposefully sleep deprive someone to see if their mortality rate is going to increase. Like that would be a highly inhumane study and would just never happen. But has like sleep been correlated with, like poor sleep being correlated with other things? Well, yeah, but also a lot of people who sleep less are maybe also working high stress jobs, which then means that maybe it's high stress that contributes to, I don't know, like increased heart disease. So a lot of times it's like if we are not sleeping, then we think, okay, it's the lack of not sleep that is going to be in some way harmful for me. But realistically, no, like it's not as harmful as people think it is. And if anything, going back to your point earlier, like what I learned is we're a lot more resilient than we think. And also too, insomniacs tend to underestimate how much they've slept, because sometimes even if you don't think that you're sleeping, you're in a very kind of light stage of sleep. So you almost remember it as being awake, but you're actually asleep. So they underestimate how much they're sleeping just as much as good sleepers overestimate how much they sleep.
No, it's interesting to see that dissonance there for sure. And just going into that, I know there are physiological things, and you're right about the inhumane experiments. The only experiment I know of, man, the name escapes me, but if I'm not mistaken, it was a research project done by the Russian military back in the day, and they purposefully deprived people of sleep just to see how long they could last. That's where we got the figure that 10 days from. Take it or leave it. But the body supposedly has safety measures in there to prevent this. I mean, eventually, if you go 48 to 72 hours without sleep, you start to get into what they call micro naps or micro sleep or something.
Yeah,
is that
you start falling asleep. Yeah,
something that you experienced?
no, because I've never stayed awake for like such a long time. Like I know people that feel like they haven't slept for like 8 days, but realistically, like you said, you can't. Like your body will shut off. So you have different factors that control your sleep, or your sleep drive, which is like over an extended period of time. Like the more you're awake, the more your sleep drive increases, which is like the pressure to sleep, your circadian rhythm, and also then your sleep need, which is like your individual need of how much sleep you need. And again, even if insomniacs don't remember, like they are resting, they are getting a little bit of sleep. And like you said, these like small little micro naps, that's also when people experience like a lot of like sleep deprivation. That's why people fall asleep at the wheel, because they can't remember falling asleep. It's like your body is purposefully trying to like conserve itself, and it's shutting itself down. So I'd say a lot of times like insomniacs may think that they've stayed awake for 7 days, but realistically they most likely have slept it, even if they don't remember it.
And there's probably a lot of stigma around insomnia too, right? I mean, you said that you had a doctor write you a note, but I mean, it's not something that we tend to hear a lot about. I mean, again, you said it was about what 10%? 10% of the
Yeah.
population actually truly suffers from it. So would you say that more people are probably suffering on it? They're just not speaking up about it?
Yeah, definitely. Like once I started kind of like, I'm a very open book. I literally speak to everybody about like everything that's going on in my life. And once I started speaking about it, like somebody at work came forwards and had said like, oh, I've actually struggled with this. This is what helped me. And then someone in my friend circle apparently had been struggling with it for such a long time. And I think it's one of those things where it is deeply uncomfortable, but it's because they sometimes feel like nobody around them is going through the same, and they just fail to speak about it. But it's a very common problem. Like you can also just turn to like, I guess, Twitter or Threads now, and And you even type insomnia and it's like rampant of like people who struggle with insomnia. So common.
Yes, and my question is how much of that is maybe societal, not pointing at any one single cause, world events or social media, or now that we're more connected, we're never really turned off. So as we head into the future, and we're more and more, well, it sounds bad, but I mean, the more and more we are, I wanted to say turned on, but plugged in, I guess. Do you think that we're going to see an increase in case of insomnia?
Yeah, definitely. Because I think we just like living in a highly like stressful just environment, like whether it's alarming news on a daily basis, like at the moment, or I don't know, the environment, whatever, like pick your cause. Like I think, well, one, there's also a distinction that negative news sells very well and they're a business and that's why it sells so well because it's clickbait. But at the same time, it's like we're continuously being bombarded by this like all the time. I think that sleep disruption 100% can happen from the inability to switch off your brain at night. But then that can also turn into insomnia because we're also increasingly more pressured to be healthy and to sleep our 8 hours and to like have all of our life together. And it's like the bombardment and being continuously like kind of plugged in, like you said, and then masked with like the unrealistic expectations of how we're supposed to show up in the world. Absolutely.
If you could tell our listeners, and again, it's obviously very personalized, but if you could tell them maybe one thing that, maybe they could understand about it that would help them, what would that one thing be?
I'd say that like the primary focal point for anything that your brain does, or like your motives, your desires, everything comes down to that one rule, which is survival. And I think like it took me going through insomnia to also realize that, because it's, whether it's like what food you eat or what kind of social interactions you're exposed to, everything comes down to like that sense of belonging, that sense of like being a part of something, which comes down to that one rule of we need to make sure that you survive. And that's like the number one rule of life, which is, it's crazy because everything, like whether it's our motives, our values, like you can kind of like pare anything back down to that main reason.
Well, I definitely like that. Fiona, this has been a really interesting conversation. A lot of great insight. I mean, I learned something today for sure. We are coming up pretty close to the time. Is there anything that you wish I would have asked but didn't ask, or anything that you feel we should have covered but didn't cover today?
I think like we hit the nail on the head pretty much. Like we've covered so many different topics, and I'm sure that whoever is listening, and maybe I'm 100% sure that anybody who's listening knows someone who has insomnia. So hopefully like that at least provides a little bit of insight of maybe even something that they can share with that person if they are struggling.
Well, Fiona, it was an absolute delight having you on the show. Just before we go though, how can our listeners reach out and contact you or ask more questions?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm on Instagram and it's sleep and then _ coaching with Fiona. And then you will also find my email, everything on there. If you prefer YouTube, I'm also same hashtag. So sleep _ coaching with Fiona. And I share a lot of free resources, both on my own story and also like simple tips, as well as mindfulness tips of like how you can maybe start reclaiming your life from this.
Excellent. Well, once again, Fiona, thank you so much for being on the show. And to all our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. And just remember, if you can't find that motivation or inspiration for yourself today, maybe just go out and try to be that motivation and inspiration for someone else. And we'll see you again next time.
Thank you.